Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Williams. I'm Adult and Community Services Manager for the Columbia Public Library, which is part of the Daniel Boone Regional Library System. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn, where we'll be learning about voting in Boone County, including some updates about the State County Clerk Association and Electronic Information Center's National Voter Information Sharing System. Today's Lunch and Learn is co-hosted by the library and the League of Women Voters of Columbia Boone County. Before we begin our program, it's been a few months since we've been together on Zoom, so just a few housekeeping items. There's, if you want to ask a question of our presenter today, we're asking that you use the chat feature. So if you hover over your Zoom window with your mouse, you should see that sort of speech bubble at the bottom. Click on that and type in your question. If you're on a phone or a tablet, you may have to tap in the middle of your screen to get those tools to appear. We are recording today's presentation, so it will be available in the next day or two on both the League's YouTube channel and the library's YouTube channel for future viewing. And now I'd like to welcome our moderator, Mari Scala. She's president of the League of Women Voters of Columbia Boone County.
Hi, welcome everyone. Glad you can be with us today. It's going to be an interesting discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce Brianna Lennon. Many of you are already familiar with Brianna, but to just briefly share her bio, she currently serves as the county clerk for Boone County, Missouri, and prior to her election here in 2018, she served as an assistant attorney general in the Consumer Protection Division of the Missouri Attorney General's office, before joining the Missouri Secretary of State's office as Deputy Director of Elections and Elections Counsel. So I can't think of better preparation for serving as county clerk. In addition to serving as secretary for the Missouri Association of County Clerks and Election Authorities, Brianna is a member of several national boards, including the Bipartisan Policy Center Task Force on Elections and the Council of State Governments Overseas Voting Initiative Working Group. Brianna's going to share her remarks and her slides with us, and as we go along, feel free to type your questions into the chat, and then we'll pause after her presentation, and she'll be happy to take questions. So Brianna, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the League and to the library for putting on these lunches and learns. They're really, I think, an integral part of making sure that everybody's getting the information that they need, and especially this year we don't have an election. We didn't have an August election, we don't have a November election, so it's really vital that we don't take a break from civic engagement and democracy, so I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So just as a lay of the land, I do have a PowerPoint. I'm going to run through that to provide some information that I think is pretty interesting, provide some context for things, and then we'll segue into talking about some of the association priorities, what the association is, and then kind of information about how we arrive at those decisions, and what our thought process is when we are looking at potential legislation, what we prioritize, and kind of what it is that we that kind of justifies, I guess, what we do. So I will start sharing my screen. And just generally, I am sure that everyone that is participating in this session already knows this, but I do like to remind people that in an even numbered year, we have elections in April, August, and November. Those are municipal elections in April, the primary election in August, and the general election in November. There's been some confusion, and we will get more into this later. The presidential preference primary that was removed out of the statute did not affect the August primary. So we will still have a primary in August. County candidates, state candidates, they will all still run on a primary election. The election that people are talking about as being removed from the statute is only the presidential preference. And then, of course, as we're seeing now in odd numbered years, August and November are placeholder local elections. So that would be if the city of Columbia needed to put something on the ballot, Boone County needed to put something on the ballot, or a school district. We normally do have special elections. This is the first year in I don't know how many years that we have not had in August or November. Usually we'll have something small, you know, a special election or a vacancy to fill or something like that. But this year, everybody seemed to get things taken care of in April, so we don't have anything for the remainder of this year. Registering to vote, I'm sure most people know this as well, but qualifications are that you have to be at least 17 and a half years old, a U.S. citizen, and a Boone County resident. The voter registration deadlines are always 4 weeks before each election, and that is just for new Missouri voters. I'll get a little bit into the law that changed that makes that broader for voters that are already registered somewhere in Missouri, but that deadline applies to people that have never registered to vote before or are not currently registered to vote. You can vote next week is National Voter Registration Day on the 19th, so there'll be plenty of opportunities all over the county to get registered and talk to other people about registering to vote. So once people are registered to vote, I know that Lauren in the introduction talked a little bit about the ERIC system. List maintenance is a really critical part of our jobs as county clerks, and what that essentially means is keeping our voter roll up to date and accurate for whether it's reflecting a voter's current information. So we do that on an ongoing basis in Boone County. It's referred to as canvassing. We're required by federal and state law to canvass our records every 2 years. The way that we do that is by mailing out a canvassing ID card, which we do at the beginning of each even-numbered year. And the second step of that process, once we mail it out to you as a voter, if you get it, great. That's exactly what we want to have happen. We want you to get your information. We want you to have your voter ID card. But if it bounces back to us, then we know that there is some reason why you're not getting your mail. It may be that you moved. It may be that there was just a problem with delivery. It may be that you've passed away. All of those reasons, we don't know. We just know that we didn't get, we got returned mail from you. So that triggers us to send you a second piece of mail by forwarding mail that says, hey, we really need you to update your address. Let us know what your new address is, or let us know that there was just a problem with the mail and I still live here, but we need the voter to actually confirm their address. That happens in our county, not just every 2 years, but we do that on an ongoing basis. When we get returned mail for any reason, we send out one of those letters to let folks know that they need to update their address. We also get reports through the Secretary of State's office from Social Security Administration, Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Corrections, and the DMV. We get those on an ongoing basis. So if we get information that says that somebody has passed away, then we can look into that and then mark that person as deleted. If somebody has just received a felony, been convicted of a felony, then we know to put them in disqualified status. We also get drop-off reports. So if somebody has concluded their probation and parole, we can reinstate them on the voter roll as well. So it's a process that is really helpful to have, where we can use this information to help us know when to reach out to voters, encourage voters to update their information, and then we can keep them up to date and our voter rolls up to date. And it's great to have, I mean, from the process of the integrity of our elections, but it also saves us money as a county. So we're not sending out a bunch of sample ballots to people that don't actually live here anymore. So there's an incentive, there's many, many different incentives for why we want to keep our list up to date. NCOA reports are a way that we in Boone County, we have a vendor that our national change of address, which is provided through the post office, lets us know if on our list of voters, there may be people that have moved somewhere else. And those people have let the post office know, but they didn't necessarily let us know. So we can then proactively send letters to those folks and say, hey, we know you updated your information with the post office. Why don't you update your information with us too? So we do that on an ongoing basis as well. One of the areas of list maintenance that we were able to utilize beginning in 2018 was participation in the ERIC system. So ERIC, which Lauren spelled out exactly what that stands for, but essentially it's a consortium of member states, secretaries of state's offices that have joined together to form a nonprofit. They engage in information sharing, and then they bring that information back to their own states. They provide it to their local election authorities, and their local election authorities can then act on that information. They can send out proactive letters that say, hey, we think that you've moved. They can send out information to people that are identified as being eligible but not already registered. And they could say, hey, we noticed that you live here and you have a driver's license, but you're not registered. Here's a voter registration card, you can register. So it's to provide information to be able to be more proactive and more comprehensive in our list maintenance. The other thing that it does is it shares voter history. And voter history is a public record anyway, but it lets you see if somebody has voted in one state and also in a second state. So there were instances as well where the ERIC system could detect and then bring to the attention of the Secretary of State or the local election authority instances where somebody that might be registered in two different states, because we don't have a full-on federal system that allows you to catch all things, that somebody may be registered in Florida and they might be registered in St. Charles. They vote an absentee ballot in Florida, they vote in person in St. Charles. There's no way for us at the local level to know that unless there is information sharing after the fact that indicates that that voter has a record in both those places and voter history credit in both of those places. And so there have been instances, St. Charles is a real example where there was somebody that was registered in both Florida and in Missouri, and those people were prosecuted. Unfortunately, there has been a lot of politicization of the conversation about ERIC, and so a number of states have withdrawn from the ERIC system. Missouri is one of them. Our Secretary of State's office withdrew from the ERIC system, so we no longer have those reports available. We still do have these list maintenance reports available, but it is, like my personal opinion, it is unfortunate that we don't have more good information to work off of so that we can keep our list as clean as possible. There are some states that are looking to still join ERIC, so it is still very much a fluid situation. ERIC is not going away. There are larger states that have been talking about joining ERIC for a long time that are getting really close to pulling the trigger in their legislatures. Some states require legislative approvals. Some the Secretary of State could just do on their own. Missouri was one that Missouri just did it on their own, and so the withdrawal didn't require the legislature to get involved. So that is the current status of where we are with the ERIC system. And I can go into that more later, but I just want to run through some of the important things that I think also have been affecting Missouri voters over the last couple of years. So House Bill 1878 was the bill that went into effect August 28th of 2022. This was the bill that had a number of election changes. Parts of it are currently in litigation, but parts of it have gone into effect and have been in effect now for November 2022 and April of 2023. So now we have 2 elections worth of data, which I love data and I want to share data, so I'm going to include that. But just as an overview, there's really 3 main areas where House Bill 1873 directly affected voters. The first is that photo ID is now required. So valid IDs that people can use are Missouri driver's licenses, Missouri non-driver's licenses, U.S. passports, and U.S. military IDs. Now, there is still a lot of confusion about expiration dates, and there is a carve out in the law that says that if one of those 4 valid IDs are expired, it must have at least expired after the date of the last general election. So once we get to the next general election, that's essentially a 2-year grace period. So if you go to the November 2024 election, you want to vote in the presidential election, if your photo ID that you have expired November 15th of 2022, you can use that. So that it's still hard, I think, for people to wrap their minds around that there is still that carve out in there because it's not super obvious, but it does exist. If something is expired, as long as it expired after the date of the last general election, then it can still be used as a valid form of identification. What is not a valid form of identification are voter ID cards. So we do often field calls. Why are we even sending out voter ID cards? Well, if you think back to our list maintenance, it's actually part of our canvassing process. So our list maintenance requires us to send out voter ID cards anyway, but unfortunately, because they're not photo IDs, they cannot be used to show ID on election day. Our sample ballot mailings, though educational, cannot be used as forms of ID. Student IDs, and the reason for that is because there's some question about whether they are issued by the state of Missouri, and they definitely don't have an expiration date on them. So both of those things have to be true. It needs to be issued by the state of Missouri or the federal government, and it needs to have an expiration date on it, or be non-expiring. Student IDs don't fall into that category. University of Missouri employee IDs right now don't fall into that category. Out-of-state driver's licenses, because they're not issued by Missouri, and safe at home cards because they don't have a form of photo ID on them. What happens if you don't have a valid ID? You can contact the Secretary of State's office if you do need assistance on getting underlying documentation or things like that. But more often than not, people will just come to the polls, and if they do, they can vote this blue provisional ballot. So the steps the voter has to go through in order to do a provisional ballot is that 2 election judges of opposite political parties are going to issue the provisional ballot to the voter. They have a checklist that they follow. The voter is going to fill out the affidavit on the outside of the envelope. The voter is going to fill out their ballot, and then they're going to put their ballot into the envelope, and then the 2 election judges that helped that voter are going to sign the bottom of it to indicate that they were there to witness the process and go through the process with them. At the end of the election, all of those are brought back to our office, and the ballot is counted at the office if the signature on the envelope matches the signature on the voter registration record. And that signature includes not just the original voter registration application signature, but we keep all signed documents that a voter has filled out related to elections. So we have absentee applications on file. We have the actual provisional ballot envelope signatures we scan in to keep those as well. So we have various forms of signature that are on file because people's signatures change over time, and so we keep as many as possible. So sometimes when we have our bipartisan teams looking at these, they might look at the last 5 signatures before they count, but that's at a very high level how provisional ballots are processed in Boone County. Now, I find this slide very interesting because I think when photo ID went into effect and you saw which IDs were not going to be allowed, student IDs in a college town was top of mind for us. And so when we were preparing how many of these blue envelopes to send out, how many provisional ballots to send out, we made sure to send a bunch to places where we knew that people that were college age would be voting. And we just tried to over prepare before we had good information. Now we have been through the November 2022 election and the April 2023 municipal election, and I think that the distribution of age of who's using these blue provisional ballots is very interesting. In both of these elections, the college age group of voters is much lower than I think that we expected it to be. So I'll go into the total number of how many we had before, but a lot of people It seems like, and unfortunately, we don't have a way of tracking what form of ID they did have to be able to show, because I don't think very many of these people had no ID at all. Most of these just didn't have a allowable ID anymore. So my opinion, based on the experience that I've had in talking to voters and going out and doing absentee voting, is that a lot of times these are people that are new to town from different states that have a driver's license, but they don't have a Missouri driver's license. So they've got some form of ID, they just don't have a Missouri form of ID. Or, especially if you look into that age group, 70 to 102, and I have 102 on there because we do have voters that are 102 years old that vote by blue provisional ballot, are people that don't need an ID anymore for any reason. They're in a retirement home, they're in an assisted living facility, and they don't need to have a Missouri driver's license anymore. They might still have their Social Security card, they might still have their expired ID because they have to have something in order to get their benefits, but they don't necessarily need the types of IDs that are listed in the law. So I put this in here just so that people can have like a better understanding of who it is that this law is actually impacting in Boone County. The second thing that 1878 did was that it gave us a 2-week no excuse absentee voting period. This was amazing. This was something that the Clerks Association had asked for a very long time, and that we were hoping would be a big impact on our elections in terms of being able to plan and administer elections and have these 2 weeks where people could take advantage of it, because that's what we saw happen in 2020. And what we wanted to happen was exactly what happened. So I didn't put 2020 on this chart because it skewed everything. 2020, we had 26,000 absentee voters. That's not likely to happen in the near future. So the best one that I could do beyond that was still relevant was November of 2018. So you can see, even when the total turnout, both of the November 2022 and April 23 elections had lower overall turnout, but they had far more absentee voters. People really, 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 really like to be able to take advantage of no excuse absentee voting in person. It helps us so much because it helps evenly distribute the voters so that we can provide them with a better experience. When somebody comes in 5 days before an election, we have problems trying to verify their eligibility, or they don't have everything that they need, they still have 5 more days to get everything situated to be able to vote. If that same instance happens on election day, they're probably not going to be able to deal with our office directly, so they're going to be talking to a poll worker who has a little bit less experience in trying to make sure voters can get through the process. But B, they're not going to have any additional time to be able to fix whatever the problem is. So this gave us so much extra grace. We heard really positive things from people, and we're really excited that this is still available to voters in the near future. The third thing, which was a bit of a dark horse of a change for 1878 that not many people, I think, really knew what it meant, came from the Clerks Association. We had been advocating for this for a long time. Nobody really understood why, but we knew why. So the 4 weeks of the 4-week deadline for registering to vote, it had applied to anybody that was moving into a new county and registering to vote for the first time. Now, for about 15 years, we have been on a statewide voter registration system. If somebody is registered to vote in Callaway, I can see that in Boone County. If somebody's registered in Boone County, St. Charles County can see that in St. Charles County. It really didn't make sense to us, as we were administering the election, that we had to look a voter in the face that came in 5 days before election day and say, we can see that you're registered to vote in Callaway, but unfortunately, because you're coming into Boone County, that's considered a brand new registration and you can't vote here anymore. So we advocated to get rid of the 4-week deadline for anybody that was already registered to vote in Missouri, because we could already see them in the system. And thankfully, that was part of 1878 that passed. So up until election day, if a voter lives in Boone County but is still registered somewhere else, you can vote. It's perfectly fine. If on election day they want to do that, they still can. We're happy to do that for them, but they need to do it in our office, because our office is the only thing that can see the statewide voter registration system. You can't access that at a polling place. You can't access that at a vote center. You have to be able to come to the clerk's office to do it. So that was something that went into effect for the November 2022 election, and it had a huge impact on how many people were eligible to vote on election day. And part of that reason, I like to show these because they were in the newspaper, was that Mizzou had the forethought to get a bunch of golf carts because they were going to be moving voters around campus. And when they realized that they had all of these students that were registered in their hometowns, but not in Boone County, who had showed up at the central poll to vote, they started carting them over to our office so that they could register and change their registration to Boone County, and then they could go downstairs to our central poll and they could vote. So that picture is the little go-kart the golf cart that was driving people over here, and then we just had hundreds of students in and out of our office all day getting updated so that they could vote. And like I said, I love data. So this is the data depiction of what that actually meant. So yellow provisional ballots, those are people whose eligibility is in question. That means people that are not registered in our county, regardless of whether they're registered somewhere else. If you're not registered in Boone County, you have to vote a yellow provisional until we figure out why. If you say you're supposed to be, we need to figure out why that's the case. And maybe we can count your yellow provisional, or maybe we can't. Or you're supposed to be at a specific poll, you're not at the right poll, you're not going to leave, you don't want to leave, we're going to give you a yellow provisional to determine if there's some other reason you should be at that poll. So yellow provisionals are always last case, last resort, and that's why provisional ballots have a reputation for not counting, because if we're questioning your eligibility, at the point that we give you a yellow provisional, we've checked a bunch of other things, so it's not super likely that your vote's going to count, but we do want to offer you that ability. Blue provisionals are the new provisional ballots that exist because of the photo ID law. So if you do not have a photo ID, a valid photo ID, then you are offered a blue provisional. So you can see in November 2020, we had 218 yellow provisional ballots cast. And those were people that we couldn't determine their eligibility, most likely because they were registered in a different county. So of that, we only had 97 that were able to count. And then for the blue provisional no photo ID, because we've actually had blue provisional ballots since 2018 because of some other laws, that's still a no valid ID. We had 9 and 5 counted. And the reason why 5 counted instead of 9 counted is that those other 4 were actually supposed to be yellow. They were eligibility issues, but the poll workers gave them a blue one instead of a yellow one. So when it comes back to us, it really doesn't matter if it comes as a yellow or a blue. We know generally what we're supposed to be looking for. But if we got a blue provisional ballot that the person's not registered, that really is supposed to be a yellow provisional. So it's not that it's not counting because of a signature match. It's not counting because they're not eligible to vote in the first place. August 2022, that was still before the new law went into effect. We had 15 yellows, 2 of them counted, so you can see very, very few of them count. And then 2 blue provisionals were cast, and both of them were counted because they were signature matches. Now, the new law went into effect November 2022, we completely switched. So our yellow provisional ballots just plummeted because all those other people that wouldn't have been able to vote before because they weren't registered in Boone County could register in Boone County on election day. So we only had 40, which was unheard of. We've never had so few yellow provisional ballots. And 5 of them counted because 35 people legitimately were not registered at all in Boone County. But we did see our blue provisional ballot skyrocket. a little less than what we anticipated, but 297 of them were cast across the county. 281 counted, and I have a little more granular level data, but again, there were a number of them that should have been yellows, and so it's not that our bipartisan team rejected all of the ones for not having the right signature. It's that they had eligibility issues as well. And then in April of 2023, we had one yellow provisional. That was legitimately somebody that wasn't registered to vote here. And we had 54 blue provisional ballots cast, and 52 of them counted. So it really, 1878 has had a huge impact on the way that we process these provisionals. But really what it means is that it's had a big impact on who's been enfranchised in this, under this law. And it's really, I mean, 1878 is a really mixed bag when you include things like photo ID, and that you can update your address on election day, and that you have 2 weeks of no excuse absentee. It is, you know, pretty much the definition of a compromise bill. So when the Clerks Association is in favor of it, we have no resolutions with regard to what clerks feel about initiative petition reform, what clerks feel about photo ID, because if there are issues that are partisan, we do not take a position on them. Our association is very much a bipartisan association that runs in a nonpartisan way, the same way that we feel that we run our offices. So what we think about when we're getting together and we're having our meetings and we're passing our resolutions, we're looking at the logistics of the election. So every election period to us, it's about 16 weeks long. Overlapping elections can lead to unintended consequences for voters and districts. That's my segue into talking about the presidential preference primary. So the Clerks Association doesn't have like a theoretical or a moral stance on the fact that the presidential preference primary existed. What we had an issue with was that it was within 3 weeks of the April election. In 2016, that decimated St. Louis County's ability to run a successful April election, and they had to redo so many of their districts because people got the wrong ballots. They didn't have time to do adequate testing. They didn't have time to get their polling places ready, because turning over everything in that short period of time was nearly impossible for a county their size. Now, that wasn't the case for everybody. There are counties that can manage a turnaround. We are very much on the fence about, you know, we probably have enough resources, but it's going to be really tight. 2020, we were more than prepared to do that, but we didn't have to deal with it because the April election was moved to June. So 2020 was a bad year for comparisons because we didn't have that short 3-week period of time. Nobody was complaining about running the March presidential preference primary because they thought that we shouldn't have a primary. They just wanted it moved. So I will tell you, as like a background context for the association, there were a number of things that were pitched around. Our resolution actually said that it's either got to be moved or we've got to get rid of it. Like we've got to do something. We've got to have a conversation about it. But I think given the political realities of things, a nuanced version of things that ends up affecting a bunch of downstream consequences, like, well, what if we just took the March election and combined it with the April election? Well, that's going to add in partisanship to general municipal elections. Are school districts okay with that? What's the timing going to be like that? So anytime we talked about moving it, because there were so many complications, nobody was really interested in having like a huge conversation about, okay, this is broken and how do we fix it? It was more like, it's broken. Is the best that we're going to do just getting rid of it because nobody wants to entertain the fact that, like, you won't even accept the fact that it's broken? So at the end of the day, I think the Clerks Association felt like it really needed to advocate that it was an untenable way to run elections to have them overlapping. I will say for Boone County, what we saw was people that needed to vote absentee, which is the permanent absentee list, generally people with disabilities, people over the age of 65 or 70. that are wanting their absentee ballots by mail, well, we'd send them an April ballot and a March ballot, and then they would put them in the wrong envelopes, and then neither of them would count. And so we'd have voters that would get confused. We'd have people that would come into the office to vote absentee in person, and we'd have 2 voting tabulators set up, and they'd go, well, which one do I put it in? So logistically, there are better ways to do it, but until we've had that conversation, I think that's the perspective. I know that's the perspective that the association had in beginning the conversation about the presidential preference primary. So there's obviously all of the talking points the Secretary of State's office has put out, and calling it a glorified popularity contest and things like that, because the logistics of adding in caucuses and all those kinds of things, that is not where we are coming from when we're looking at this legislation. We're looking at it from an administration perspective. Similar to that, that's why even in an association where literally over 100 of 116 are Republican county clerks, we unanimously support expanding no excuse absentee voting, because we know that logistically and administratively it works better for us and it works better for voters. So we have and we continue to push for a full 6 weeks of in-person no excuse absentee voting. We passed that resolution again this year. We also want, one of the biggest hangups that wasn't caught in House Bill 1878 is that there's nothing that says that a voter that comes to vote absentee in person can be offered a provisional ballot. So if somebody comes to vote absentee in person and they have a student ID and no other ID, we have to tell them, well, you can go vote on election day and get a blue provisional ballot, but we can't do anything for you right now. So that's something that we're advocating, trying to change, because that's not a voter-friendly bill. It doesn't work well. We really like them to fix that. And then from the standpoint of protections and things relative to the landscape that we see going into 2024, we are, as an association, supportive of expanding the electioneering districts from 25 feet to 75 feet. Missouri is one of the shortest buffer zones of all of the country in terms of electioneering, and there are some counties that there's some really, really intense electioneering that happens. It doesn't happen in Boone County. I don't know that we've had any instances where we've had fights break out or things like that, but there are counties where that happens. And so in order to protect voters, having that 75 feet as a buffer would be helpful. I don't think that that's likely to pass. I know a lot of legislators are not in favor of that. They like the ability to be able to go all the way up to 25 feet. But that's something that's important to us. And then protections for staff and poll workers to make sure that there's a way to prevent and address any kind of harassment or violence. We've seen this happen in other states. We've seen it happen in some counties in Missouri, thankfully not in Boone County. But there's templates like the Judicial Privacy Act that was passed this year that just provide a little extra help to keeping election worker information confidential, especially when you're thinking about poll workers, people that are already volunteering their time. They're getting paid less than $200 to go work 16 hours at these polling places. They are true, like, democratic heroes for things. We should be providing them with a little bit of protection to make sure that they're not being targeted by harassers. And then the last thing that is not a super well-known thing, but is something, I put it in there as these are literally the things that we think about down to the minute layers of voter registration. The permanent disability list is for people that are considered permanently disabled. Like I said, people that have a disability or because of their age or because of a chronic illness would be considered eligible to get all of their absentee ballots by mail and get automatically sent an absentee ballot application. We want to keep that list confidential. It's already a vulnerable population of people. The law is not clear about if somebody came into our office and said, tell me everybody that you have on the permanent disability list. It's not clear whether I'm supposed to give that out or not. We don't feel good about giving that list out. We don't want to give that list out. More likely than not, we would say we have a case for not making it public but we want some certainty in the law that this is a confidential list, because nobody really has, in our views, nobody really has a legitimate reason for wanting that list. You can ask for the absentee list if you're a candidate or if you're an absentee voter yourself of who gets an absentee ballot. But to just get this one list of people that we're going to send absentee ballot applications to, we feel it's important to keep that protected to give the voter a level of privacy. So hopefully I ran through that in a way that makes sense, where I can take questions now or do whatever Mari wants me to do.
Well, yeah, thank you very much. You did pack a lot into that. I'll take the moderator's prerogative. I want to encourage others to please put questions in the chat, but I had a couple prepared in advance. One of the, from the perspective of the League of Women Voters, we are pretty active in trying to register people to vote. And an issue that's come up recently are questions about the status of, it's our understanding there was a registration requirement in order for people to go out and register voters, and that has been stayed by the courts, but that stay is not necessarily being observed by the Secretary of State. And so my question is basically just, what is the status of that registration requirement? Should we be heeding it, or can we freely register people to vote without it?
So right now, yes, it is stayed by the court. I have not heard of anything from the Secretary of State's office that has issued things otherwise. If you have heard something, like if you've gotten an email or something, please forward that to me, because we do keep in contact with the Secretary of State's office quite often, but we have not been told otherwise that would not be the case. The law says that if you are going to register more than 10 voters, then you need to fill out a voter registration solicitor form. That law is going, like she said, it's going through the litigation process, and there is a preliminary injunction that has stopped that from happening. That case is not moved, so there has been no change on that. And there's also a little bit, and I hate to introduce a gray area, but I know that it exists. There's not a lot of certainty when it comes to if you are registering people and then you're collecting those paper forms, that's pretty clearly registering voters. If you are standing at a table with an iPad and telling people to register by going online to this iPad, there's no way for them to link any of the people that registered to vote back to you as the person that asked them to register to vote. So I don't think that is necessarily a solicitation, because you're just putting out that public information. Like I said, though, it's a gray area, and one that I haven't heard the Secretary of State's office really have an answer for at this time. But as of right now, that stay is still in effect. But like I said, feel free to reach out to my office, send me an email directly if you've seen something otherwise.
Last I checked, it was still on the Secretary of State's website for one thing, but I haven't heard of specific instances. But we're getting some really good questions in the chat. And I'm going to go to Linda Smith's question first, just simply because it follows directly on what we've been talking about. She's asking, what is your preference when we're registering voters? Do you prefer that we use the paper form or the online format? And then follow up to that, she asks, what happens to a voter registration application that's submitted through the Secretary of State site?
Those are both great questions. I don't know that we necessarily have a preference as to whether it comes in by mail. It does take a little extra effort to do the ones that have come in by mail, because or in person if you just come drop them off, because we have to scan those in, then we have to manually type in the information, and then we have to save and verify those. So it does lead to occasionally there being some typos or things like that if we can't read the writing. You know, when somebody's handwriting something, it can be hard to tell whether somebody's date of birth is a 5 or an 8, or, you know, if they scribble it. So that can lead to just data integrity. So that's, in my mind, that's not a huge deal. The online voter registration forms on the Secretary of State's website or to our website, there's slightly different scenarios. So if it comes from the Secretary of State's office, it actually goes into a queue in the statewide voter registration system. So every day we log on to that system and we have a queue of, you know, 30 to 110 to, and some days it's been like 500, depending on how many people registered to vote. It's an overnight process. So what we processed today was what was submitted yesterday up until 10 p.m. When you register to vote on our website directly, we control the queue of that. So if you register on our website or you update your address on our website, we can look at our queue on the back end and we can see it within a minute of you submitting it. So I like that our website does that, but our website, you still have to do the same things that we do with the paper form, which is we print it off, we scan it back in, and then we type it out. It's easier to read, so we don't have to worry about typos, but because our system isn't integrated with the state system, it still has to be processed in a little lengthier way. So I would say I don't have a ton of preference either way. It's all our job to process them, and all of them have pros and cons.
Okay, thank you. Aaron Kravitz would like to know what percentage of votes are absentee. I presume that varies from one election to another, but
it does, and I think that's one of the things that I find most interesting, you know, as I've been tracking things over time. When you look at previous elections, so for November 2022, for example, it was about 14%, which is way higher than we'd ever had before. 14% in November 2022 compared to 7% in November of 2018. In 2020, obviously, like I said, that number was astronomical, so it was 30%. I would love to see us get up to 30%. 30% is exactly why the in-person on election day voting in November of 2020 went so well. Same for the other two elections in 2020. We had about 21% in August of 2020, 27% for the local election in 2020. This past April, we were at 9%, which is really not bad at all for an April election. So the closer that we can get to 20 to 30%, the happier that I am. I think there's still a lot of education that we need to do to let people know that it's available. The number of times, especially for local elections, where we've gone and tried to promote it and heard people just say, it's fine, I can wait till Tuesday. Like, I know you can wait till Tuesday, but what if something happens? You could vote now. It's the same process too, and that's something that I think is hard to get people to internalize, that voting in person absentee, it's the same ballot, it's the same process, and it goes into the same machine as what happens on election day. So you have the same process and the same experience, you're just having it at our office instead of at your poll.
okay. Marilyn McLeod would like to know, she says there's a current lawsuit about the strict voter ID requirements. What is the opinion of the Clerks Association on the restrictions on the kinds of IDs permitted?
So the Clerks Association has not taken a stance on photo ID, because we know as an association that people have strong feelings in both directions. So there's really no ability to have a consensus on photo ID when there are those kinds of philosophical differences. The association, I will say the association's biggest concern, and it's why we keep passing resolutions about no excuse absentee, is that if that lawsuit is successful in overturning photo ID, it also eliminates the 2 weeks of no excuse absentee. So we, as an association, made the choice to continue promoting a new bill that has no excuse absentee in it so that we can get it as a standalone, so that regardless of what that lawsuit does, we still get no excuse absentee. We will forever keep pushing for that.
Okay. Kathy Jensen says she got an email from the Brennan Center about an alternative to ERIC that's been created that some states are using after withdrawing from ERIC. Has Missouri joined this, or do you have any knowledge or concerns about that organization?
I have heard rumors and rumblings about that as well. I haven't seen anything substantive. What I will say from my own experience when I was in the Secretary of State's office before in 2014 was that there was a precursor to ERIC, although I don't know that you'd call it a precursor, that they would not call it a precursor, called the Cross-State Match, which was housed in Kansas. And that had a lot of limitations, provided a lot of false positive information, and generally it just kind of crumbled over time. People didn't find it particularly useful, so they just stopped doing it. And ERIC was created specifically because there was no other way that information sharing was going to happen in any sort of meaningful or efficient or secure way. So I have read similar statements that, you know, some of these states may engage in these. I don't know how accurate or anything that they are. What I will say is, from Missouri's perspective, the way that our infrastructure is, our Secretary of State is not responsible for maintaining our voter rolls. They're responsible for making sure we have a statewide voter registration database, but they can't register a person and they can't delete a person's registration. So the best that they can do is, if they join a new system, they can provide us with the reports that are generated from that system, but it's still up to us as local election authorities about how we want to act on them. So if they are good information and we send out proactive letters that say, hey, you need to update your address because we've identified that it's possible you've moved, then that's what we can take out of it.
Aaron Kravitz asks, is there any chance that non-specific polling place voting will be allowed?
Vote centers and vote anywhere like St. Louis County has. So I think that there's the biggest obstacle to implementing something like what St. Louis County has, where you can vote anywhere. Just for some background, in St. Louis County, you don't have to go to your assigned polling place, you can go anywhere. In order to make that work, that means you have to have every single ballot style that could be potentially asked for at your county available there. Now, we do have 3 permanent central polling locations. That's the Boone County Government Center, Woodcrest Chapel in South Columbia, and Friendship Baptist Church in North Columbia. Those have been in effect since for the last 2 years, and they've been very successful. So if somebody has can't go to their polling place or just happens to be in that area, you can go to one of those 3 central polling locations. Anybody can vote there. We give all of the ballot styles to those 3 locations. So we have to have really well-trained poll workers that can be there in order to hand out all of those ballot styles. Now, you can do a ballot on demand system, which is what St. Louis County has, where when a voter gets checked in, that's when your ballot prints. So they don't pre-print your ballots. Every voter gets their individual ballot. That's relying on, and I love what St. Louis County does. I'm a little bit not brave enough to do it because, for one thing, we just bought our new equipment in 2019, and that cost almost $1 million, and we would have to have a similar outlay to change how we do ours. But also, you're relying on off-the-shelf printers to not break. So if you're at a polling place and the printer breaks, you have to wait for a new printer to come because you don't have backup ballots. The other way people with the equipment that we have in Boone County has done it is to say, okay, you can vote anywhere, but you have to use the touchscreen. because the touchscreen is the only thing that we can put all the ballot styles on. And regardless of where you go to vote, it can pull up your ballot style on the touchscreen. I don't think, based on conversations that I've had with people and when we bought the voting equipment and did public surveys and demonstrations, that people would be particularly happy being forced to use the touchscreen machines. I do know of several counties that do that. Greene County and Kansas City both do that, where if you are going to vote absentee, for example, in either of those places, they require you to do it on the touchscreen, because that's the only efficient, cost-effective training way that they can do it with their current equipment. So it is sort of like a ballot on demand, but instead of being like the paper ballot that they can hand to you, it's the touchscreen printed out ballot that's fed into the machine. So there are lots of different ways. It's something that I constantly think about. I think it's so cool that St. Louis County does it. I just think that it would be a long implementation period, and it took St. Louis a long time to implement it as well. There was a lot of legwork at the front end that went into it.
Right. We only have a couple minutes left, so I want to be sure to get the last question in. And that's from Marilyn Milovich. She says, I may have missed this info, but what was the rationale given by our state to withdraw from ERIC?
So the ERIC system, being a nonprofit board, means that if they want to change the bylaws, or they want to change the rules of what the states are required to do when they join ERIC, they have to do it as a group, like they have to vote on it as a consensus. And my understanding, based on what I read from our Secretary of State's office, was that there were changes that they wanted to see made to the bylaws and organizational structure that did not pass. They were not successful in passing those changes, and so they didn't want to continue being in the group anymore. I don't know what those changes were that they wanted, just that they wanted some changes, they didn't get them, so they left.
Well, thank you for that. I want to work in a plug for, first of all, I want to thank you very much for this very informative presentation, and for all the good questions that were asked and answered. And I also want to put in a plug for next month's Lunch and Learn, which will be on October 11th. And for the first time since pre-pandemic, we're going back to, in this case, a hybrid format. So we'll have a live opportunity to get together at the library on October 11th. And it will also be broadcast by Zoom. And the speaker will be, it's the 50th anniversary of the Sunshine Law, the Public Information Act in Missouri. And the speaker will be Kathy Kiley from the School of Journalism. We'll talk about that. So thank you very, very much, Brianna. And we hope to see the audience again next month.
Thanks, everyone. We appreciate it. Take care.